Welcome to Navigating the Four podcast, where we discuss all things faith, healing, leadership, and communication. Exploring the topic of communication, I'm Matt Barker, and I'm joined by the other host of the podcast, tackling the topic of faith. We have Freed Hardeman Professor of Bible, Matt Cook.
Hey, guys.
Exploring the perspective of leadership, we have Assistant Dean of Emerging and Innovative Programs at Freed Hardeman, Mr. Jared Gott.
Hello.
And exploring all things mental health, we have Director of the University Counseling Center at Freed Hardeman, Mr. Nathan Judd.
Hey.
As always, thanks for joining us for this episode of Navigating the Four, where we bring you real talk, fresh perspectives, and a few laughs along the way. Whether you're in the middle of figuring life out or just here for some good conversation, you're in the right place. So grab a seat, maybe a cup of coffee, and let's start navigating the four together. All right, today our episode will focus on the topic of faith. So to introduce this episode, it's our faith expert, Dr. Matt Cook. So
wow.
Matt, look at that.
Wow, the faith expert.
He's the minister of the bunch, so he's going to introduce kind of what we're talking about today.
Pressure.
All right, so the title of today is Dead or Alive, Why Some Churches Thrive or Die. I mean, I'm guessing a lot of our listeners and all four of us, we love church. We love our experience, most of our experiences with church. And we want to see our churches thrive for the glory of God. But we've all seen churches that have thrived, and we've all seen churches that have struggled. Right? And maybe we've been a part of those churches and we've seen it struggle for a period of time. Or I think about a lot of people who maybe think about their grandparents' church. Some church that like they watched it, they knew it was thriving at one time, but they've watched it over the past 30 years maybe just slowly dwindle. And either now it's just a shadow of what it once was, or in some cases, like they've closed their doors. And man, it's heartbreaking, right? And so I think it's really interesting to talk about the factors that cause a church to thrive versus the factors that cause a church to die. And I guess up front, I want to say this: we're not out to church bash here, right? It's really, really
Right.
easy to do that. So that's not our goal. Our goal, though, is to like help by identifying problems and solutions. So I think this is going to be kind of fun for each of you guys to talk about this from your perspective of expertise, right? So first question I'm going to throw out to you guys is this. Let's start with the negative. What might cause a church to struggle in your specific area? So we'll let Jared talk about leadership, Nathan, mental health, Matt Barker, communication. I'll talk about ministry. So Jared, we'll start with you. How have you seen churches struggle and sometimes even die because of leadership problems?
So I think to begin my part, and I think this is a good maybe point of clarification before we have any of this, like I don't know where all our listeners are from and their backgrounds. The four of us are all members and or like Matt, you and I both work for, I mean, we are all members of the Churches of Christ. And so if you're listening and you're not familiar with even kind of the organization of the Church of Christ, there's no like national governing body or anything like that. Every congregation is sort of self-governed by its own leadership of church-appointed elders and deacons. And so I think that may inform some of the stuff that I'm saying, because it would be different if I was talking about leadership of other religious organizations. They have like a centralized body that may give directives or guidance or stuff like that. When I'm talking about churches and leadership, it's in some ways maybe a little tougher, but also a more organic and sort of community building thing to have members who are leading, who have been appointed to leadership roles.
Yeah, that's true. But I think it is also true that most of the churches, like most evangelical churches in the United States, like failures happen at the local level, right?
Sure, yeah.
There are some like broader organizations, but even like around here, we've got a lot of Southern Baptist friends. Though they have their Southern Baptist convention, really that's sort of a 1-day, 2-day thing. The real deal is like community churches, Southern Baptist churches, Churches of Christ, like failures happen at the local level. And so,
absolutely.
So I agree with you. I'm just saying, like, it's still like the principles I think you'll talk about fit anywhere.
Right.
Though we've got some special challenges probably.
So I think that when a specific leadership challenge, and I don't know of a specific example of this necessarily, I just think this is where it could happen on the leadership side of the spectrum, is that what might cause a church to struggle may be a leader's willingness or ability to lead. And here's what I mean by that. We establish leaders based on some biblical principles, right? And are looking to them for spiritual leadership. And I think that is the priority, first and foremost. Like, these people are guiding the members of their congregation, brothers and sisters in Christ, spiritually. But there is also a component of someone may be qualified to lead spiritually. They may, be able to model godly behavior and all these things, but also can they just lead like in a organizational sense, right? Can you provide a direction? Can you manage a budget? Do you have the skill set to do those kinds of things? And so I think there are individuals who may have a willingness to lead and the spiritual qualifications to lead, but may not have had the life experiences or the ability to lead in an organizational sense that then can lead to a congregation or a church suffering, not because of an intentional, ill-informed bad decision, but just I didn't know I needed to do this. I'm thinking of churches who have run into problems with specifically budgets or managing personnel and stuff like that. And some of those, they're not necessarily spiritual qualities. They're just, has someone ever had to hire and fire somebody? Has someone ever had to manage a budget? I think when those qualities are lacking, that can lead a church to struggle.
That's fascinating. I think there's lots of ways that could play out. One of the things that comes to my mind as you're talking about that is like inability to delegate. Like that's something you learn from leadership over time.
Absolutely.
And I mean, how many church leaders have you seen that like they try to do it all, they get overwhelmed, nothing happens well, when really like deacons, like church members could be doing that stuff. But they either throw it all on the ministry staff or like the elders, the leaders try to do it themselves. Yeah.
Or somebody does have a lot of those skills, like the business type skills, right? But then may feel like they don't have the skills to go out and relate to people on an individual level. And so then people don't feel connected with, even though the church is being managed properly. It takes a balance of all these things. It's a really hard ask.
Yeah.
I remember witnessing personally a smaller congregation that thought the preacher was like, we pay them, so they're supposed to do it all. And that church or congregation is basically non-existent now. People still show up, but I mean, they just kept having preachers come and go. People get burned out, have to do it all. Yeah,
absolutely.
What about communication, Matt?
So communication, Jared and I were talking before the podcast, a lot of the leadership aspects go hand in hand with communication. So when we think about communication and specifically having a clear mission and goals, what do we want our church to be about? Obviously, we find out in the Bible that we need to be about saving souls, all the different things we read about throughout Scripture. But how do we articulate that, right? How do we articulate to the congregation what we want our mission and goals to be? What are we about as a congregation? Are we a mission-minded congregation? Hopefully a lot of different things is what makes up who we are, but how do we articulate that? We can have the best plans and intentions, right? But if we don't communicate that to others, like you talked about delegating, if we could have a plan of how we want to execute something, but if we don't involve others, they're not going to want to stick around, right? The people that want to stay at churches and help are ones that feel included. So part of a leadership's role, obviously everybody's role in this, is we have to include others, make them feel like they are a part of something, that they're a part of the mission and goals that we have. But honestly, communication-wise, from what I've seen at not just the church I attend now, but also any church that you go to, and this is true with businesses or organizations as well, is how do you address conflict? Okay, so if we're thinking about if a church is growing or shrinking, a lot of times that has to do with how members are interacting with each other, right? If you think about a conflict that happened between a large group of people and that doesn't end well because maybe leadership didn't handle that the way they should have. Maybe it's just, we need to be away from each other. Whatever the case is, you could lose a lot of members by one conflict between one or two people, right? You could take sides. There's gossiping probably that's involved with that. So a lot of this goes back to our communication. How is it handled? When we think about it, not addressing conflict, sometimes that goes back to not being transparent. So we're not, obviously there's situations where leadership cannot reveal certain things. We understand that. There's certain things with members of the congregation. We can't reveal things about that, whatever it is. But there's also things that, communication-wise, maybe it feels like we're not being included. We're not, somebody's hiding something from us and we're not being transparent, but also just the conflict aspect. I mean, think about, the church is the people. And people have conflict. People have different personalities. People have differences in opinions on things. How is that addressed? A lot of times that's the health of your church. Do we try to hide it? Do we, say that this never happened? or do we address the conflict and try to help people grow from that? So I think conflict is a big one, not just in churches, businesses, schools. How do we address that conflict is a big one, I think, for communication-wise, how that's handled. And again, it's like Jared said, this isn't necessarily something that leaders are always trained on, right? We can be a spiritual leader, but are we trained on how to handle conflict? Maybe someone that's a counselor or someone in a field that handles that a lot, maybe is more equipped to do that. But sometimes these leaders that we have maybe just haven't had to deal with that. So they don't know exactly the best way to do that. So I think conflict's a big one, at least for communication. Nathan, what mental health wise, what do you think about?
Yeah. Well, I was also just thinking, have you guys ever been in a relationship where there wasn't conflict? I mean, like a long relationship, conflict's just a part of relationship. But when I think about mental health, there's a lot that goes into this. So what might cause a church to struggle in the area of mental health? I have a lot of thoughts that come up. I'm remembering an experience where a leader was asked a question. It was kind of an open dialogue thing. And someone asked him how it should be handled when trauma happens from church leaders or from people in the church, I believe the question was. And the person was kind of on the spot and I think tried to come up with a good answer. So I don't fault him for the answer that he gave, but he said something along the lines of sometimes when a lot of good people are together, good people hurt other good people. And I think that's true. I mean, but when I think the context of the question was like something horrible happened, and then the people who heard that may have had horrible things happen, and what they heard was a church leader say, well, that was a good person. And I think we have to recognize that mental health is real and not diminish it is one thing. Speak about it openly. I'm not thinking about a specific church when I say this, so I genuinely am not don't try to figure out what church it is, but I've heard stories about churches that something happens and they try to keep it hush-hush. So much hurt comes from that. Just being real about mental health, I think, is the first thing. Calling things for what they are, letting people be where they are. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to hurt. Also, I think about Bible verses that were used when I was growing up, like don't be anxious about anything, or when Jesus was in the storm at the sea. I remember him saying he rebuked them. That's what I remember, for being afraid. And the Bible doesn't say he rebuked them. It says he rebuked the wind and the waves. And so I've gone back to read Scripture from a lens of, instead of don't be afraid, it's more, don't be afraid, like a comforting thing. And I think we in religion need to be more open to, maybe this is getting into the next question, but more open to the idea that all emotion is God-given. And instead of shaming people for feeling certain ways, letting them be where they are and recognizing God gave them that emotion. So I don't think we've done that a lot. I think things are getting better, at least from the context that I'm in the situation I'm in. But historically, I think we haven't been comfortable letting people feel what they feel.
Yeah, and I think with speaking with communication, dealing with mental health, it's not always what you say to people; it's how you say it. Like you mentioned, the way that you say, "Do not be afraid," right? And, or maybe you're almost like you're coming down on somebody, right? So there's different ways to communicate with them. The way that anybody in a church communicates with each other, understanding the needs of everyone that you're communicating with, and understanding if there is some sort of issue going on with them, to make sure that you're sympathetic to that. Try to show some empathy when you're communicating with them, because I think that's a cultural thing too. I think older people are like, well, we'll just, we'll deal with our feelings on our own. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to communicate about it. And that's something that needs to change, and I think has changed over the years, and it is discussed a lot more. It's not more of a hush-hush thing like you mentioned, but it does need to be communicated. It does need to recognize that these issues are out there and that people need some resources to help them with it. Yeah. And churches can be that resource for them, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
What's cool about all three things that just got mentioned is how tightly they're interrelated, right? You don't know you've never dealt with conflict as a leader. You've never you want to lead, you have the biblical qualifications, but you've never done it before. Like, you don't know how to deal with conflict. And then how often does a church conflict? Like, people start leaving, church starts declining, and nobody mentions it. And then 30 years later, like, people like think back to their childhood and it's like, man, this trauma, like church was a disaster because leaders didn't know how to lead and they didn't communicate about a conflict in a church. And man, you got like disaster.
Yeah.
Like, this can kill churches. And I guess I try to say this to churches, like, sounds kind of cliche preacher thing to say. Like, the Church of Jesus Christ will never die, but local congregations will, like, if they're not led well. And that's really sad. So here's, from a ministry perspective, I would say the thing that I see that causes churches to struggle, kind of different. It's not as tightly related to you guys. What you guys said is when churches refuse to, the big fancy word is contextualize, which means to adapt to the culture. We've all, and it's kind of funny, sad but funny. We've all walked into churches where, like, you walk in, and from the moment you walk in the door, maybe from the moment you pull in the parking lot, it feels like you've gone back in time 40 years. And then you walk into the lobby and you look around and, like, the lobby looks like it's from 40, 50 years ago. And then you walk in to the auditorium where people are talking, and, like, the worship service, the way people are dressed, just the words they use and the formalism, sometimes it feels like this is 40 years ago. And obviously our culture has changed. And so I think when we don't adapt to culture in the way that our church buildings look, in the way that we do church and interact with people, and then even connected to that, when we don't adapt to our neighborhoods, like, when a neighborhood has changed and that church does not look like its neighborhood, then I can pretty much guarantee that that church is probably on the decline. At the same time, I was just with a church last week where changing neighborhood in Nashville. Church has been there a long time. The demographic that was there when this church thrived 50, 60 years ago is no longer in that neighborhood for the most part. But the church adapted and has a thriving Hispanic ministry. And, like, it was a youth sort of thing. And, like, it seemed like the entire youth group was Hispanic. And so that church is thriving because what have they done? They've said, okay, we're going to minister to the people who live in our neighborhood. And boy, it was like you could just feel the vibe of excitement, and you could tell that church was thriving because they adapted to what was going on around them.
I think that does tie. Like, that's kind of what I was trying to allude to with, do you have a direction of how you want to execute sort of the mission of the church is, okay, what's going on around us and how can we capitalize on that? How can we be most effective in evangelism and serving others given what's going on around us?
Okay, so we've hit the negative, and I had several, like, I could ask several questions because what you guys said was so fascinating. There's so much, we could probably spend 40 minutes on each one of these, which of course we're not going to do. So let's shift to the positive, right? So those are some negative things that we've seen, and we didn't give too many examples so as to not incriminate any specific places.
I was a little worried when you started saying, I visited this church in Nashville.
No, it was a positive.
There's a bunch of them there. They won't be able to narrow it down.
So when churches are thriving, from your area of expertise, what do you think the key, or at least one of, I know there's no single key to success, but what do you think one of the keys to success is for churches that are thriving when it comes to your area? Jared.
Okay, so I want to give a book recommendation real quick because I'm sitting here holding this book and I'm about to pull something out of it. But the book is called The Way of the Shepherd by Kevin Lehman and Bill Pintack. Lehman and Pintack, if you're listening, you can throw me a bone for that. But no, it is maybe the best book I've read as far as, like, just a small little book on relevant leadership. And I try to go through it every year or two and have a lot of notes written on it. But one sentence that I've pulled out of this is that your people can forgive you not knowing what you're doing if they can trust you. Right. And so, and this is not a book about church leadership. This is a book just about organizational leadership. And so it's kind of the opposite of, or the other side of the coin from what I just said. If you have, those spiritual qualities, you are willing to lead, you have a heart to lead, and you're leading with authenticity, and you're leading with compassion, and you're leading with grace, and you're leading with humility. If you don't know a specific skill set, people can forgive that and support you and can fill in those gaps so long as they know they can trust you and they're willing to follow you, right? And so I think when you see the key to success for churches that are thriving, It's those individuals who have a heart to lead and have a willingness to lead, actually stepping up and leading despite any deficiencies that they have. And I think we could all think of individuals who we respect and we love who have stepped up to lead in various ways, even though they knew about themselves, I'm not great at this, right? Or I'm not the best person to do this, but having the humility to say, I'm still going to lead. I'm still going to put myself in that position and take on that responsibility and that burden for everybody, but I may need your help to help me lead. I mean, that's servant-based leadership. That's what you're looking for. So I think when we see churches that are thriving, it's because they have those individuals who have built that trust with the people that they're leading, and then they decide, I'm actually going to step up and do the things that have to be done in order to lead.
And those great leadership teams, going back to our draft from a couple of weeks ago, right? They're balanced, right? You have different strengths. And so if you can find, ideally, like a great leadership team in a church, each leader has different strengths, and those strengths overcome the deficiencies of others, right?
Absolutely. And for that leadership team to have the willingness to say, I'm not great at this part, but this person is, and so I'm going to elevate them and get them to support me. That's huge.
Matt?
So communication-wise, thinking about why churches, either die or thrive, it's kind of the opposite of what we just talked about when the way that churches maybe die. What are we doing the opposite of that to help us thrive? So if we churches that die have a lack of mission and goals and different things, a clear mission that we're communicating, churches that thrive have that clear mission and they're communicating that effectively to the flock, to the congregation that they serve. And I think it's the way that's done is communication-wise, are they authentic when they do it? Are they real? Are they communicating that message in a way that is that hits home with the congregation that they're serving? Again, like you have to figure out who it is in the congregation, what makes us who we are, and then utilizing the talents of everyone that you can to accomplish that mission. Okay, and a lot of what the mission is detailed out for us in Scripture. So it's not something that's a secret necessarily. But each church is a little bit different maybe on how they execute that because of who the congregation is, who's in the neighborhoods, who are we trying to serve. And I think people can catch on pretty quick if you're not authentic. And so when we're communicating with others, we need to make sure that what we're telling them, our lives, we live out what we're saying. If you find someone that is just not real and they're just not very authentic in the way they're doing it, that they catch on pretty quick to that. And they're not going to want to go to a congregation that people already have that phrase that you hear a lot. Oh, I just don't want to go to the church because they're just filled with a bunch of hypocrites, right? And if we are just reinforcing that idea to them by not being real when we're speaking to them and communicating with them, that just makes that maybe misconception even worse a lot of times. And I think also the thriving churches, like we talked about conflict, they don't shy away from difficult conversations. Growing churches adapt to what happens at different times throughout their ministry. There's going to be, I can think of examples in different churches I've been to where growth causes sometimes some issues with, you have these members of the congregation that have maybe particular needs that they have, or maybe some challenges that are going along with these members that we have coming into the congregations. How does the congregations adapt to that? Having some of those difficult conversations, vocalizing that, communicating to those individuals and to the congregation, how are we going to serve these people that are coming in? Growing churches adapt to those that they're serving. And if we do that, then churches are going to be a lot better equipped to have that growth. If we're closed off to people coming in and not really welcoming them, communicating to them that we're glad that they're there, then they're just going to go somewhere else that they feel like they can use their talents and are valued. So I think some of that goes back to how do we address conflict? How do we address difficult conversations? Are we addressing them, or are we just trying to push it under the rug? That's where we get into, just for example, if you have a conflict and only thing that's being done is just people are trying to just kind of keep it from getting out. You don't really feel like anything is being done. You don't feel valued. You don't feel like anybody really cares about the way you feel about something. You're more likely to not want to be around people that do that. You want them to be able to address it in a way that is biblical, in a way that is good for both parties. So a lot of that goes back to dying churches don't handle conflict well. They don't understand their mission and goals. Thriving churches do understand that mission. They understand what goals they have. It's communicated effectively to the congregation, and they address conflict, have those difficult conversations in a way that benefits everyone as best they can, I think.
So what about, just a question for you, Matt?
Yeah.
So I think about authenticity. And you mentioned, making guests feel welcome. Every church says something like this: "We're so glad that you're here. Welcome to our guests," or "Welcome to our visitors." Guests is probably a better word to use. How can churches communicate that in a way that is actually authentic and not just a phrase that we say every Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, we hear that from the guy that does announcements every Sunday, and it does seem kind of like, it's almost not rehearsed, but it's just kind of something we say. And I think it's not just talking about it in the pulpit, but having these, Jared, what do we call it at our church? The greeters team, something like that. They call it something, but Scott Kemple is the one that's kind of over that, and making sure that we have individuals at an individual level doing that as they come in, trying to make them feel welcome. And usually they pick people for those roles that are very outgoing, have a good personality, genuine, authentic as best we can, because we want those people to feel like they are getting someone that's talking to them on an individual level. So I think, one thing is, not just talking about in the pulpit, but having programs in place that we can utilize people in different roles that have those personalities that really fit well with that, I think is one part of it.
There was a church that we stopped while we were traveling, just, trying to find a place to worship. And a very, very small congregation, but we were in that area. The timing hit, and so we pulled off. And, it's one of those, you're traveling, so you want to just sort of duck in, and have your time of worship and then get back on the road. And it was obvious we were from out of town and visiting. But it wasn't just that they came up and greeted us, we're so glad to have you here. They had, like, I guess a care package is the best way to describe it, which is fine. Sometimes people will give you like literature on their church and stuff like that. This was a homemade loaf of sourdough bread and a little jar of like homemade preserves that somebody had made. And so they were like, "Look, we just want you to have this. We do a good job with our bread, and we think you'd enjoy it," or whatever. And it was, okay, this is perishable stuff. So somebody has to be constantly making this and putting the thought into it and having it ready to go. It was all, tied up and presentable. And so it's just a very tangible way to see that they were intentional about like welcoming people and giving them something and having to constantly, I guess, renew that bread or have fresh bread there. Someone is paying special attention to, I want this here in case somebody comes in. Again, off the interstate, like not just right off an exit. It was a little bit of a drive to get there. So it's not that they would necessarily be expecting a lot of traffic, but they were just so thoughtful about how do we welcome visitors that it stuck with me. And that's got to be 10 or 15 years ago at this point.
Yeah, I feel like everybody wants to know where this congregation is to go there and get some sourdough bread.
Did they give it to the everyday attendees, or?
They didn't seem to. They weren't just like passing it out. It was. I'm sure
I'm just
they
saying
did.
I want to go there.
But that makes the communication aspect easier. If you have something you're giving them, that makes it less awkward because there's something you're giving them. I'm giving somebody food. That makes everything a little bit less awkward. So from a communication standpoint, that would work well.
And it was delicious. Excellent.
All right, Nathan. So what about mental health?
Matt, I like what you said with the word authentic, because my thoughts around this are very much maybe summarized by the word authentic. But I'm just thinking about where I attend now. Last night, I heard a lesson that was on the prodigal son. The person who spoke actually referenced Tim Keller, by the way, if you're familiar with him. He has a book called The Prodigal God. And that was interesting, and I actually checked him. The word prodigal means spending money or resources freely and recklessly, wastefully extravagant. And so he referenced God as being prodigal, which I thought was a really cool take. But in the context of that story, we hear about the son that left and went and wasted everything that his father gave to him. And there's a wonderful lesson in that. But when Jesus told the story, the context, he was not speaking to those people. He was speaking to the religious, and those people would have identified as the brother. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we actually don't hear how the brother responded in the story. And so we're kind of left hanging. But I bring that up to say, I think, and I've grown up in the Church of Christ my whole life, And kind of the whole thing with the Church of Christ, the mentality is we're going to go back to New Testament church and follow what the New Testament does. And so speak where the Bible speaks, remain silent where it's silent is what I've heard my whole life. And I'm not dogging that logic or anything, but I think what can happen and what has happened a lot of times is we can make rules our God. And I think we show up to church and we say, how you doing? I'm doing fine. And I'm going to pray for this person. And it just, the words coming up for me, it just feels fake. So I'll say it. And I think we in church need to be more authentic. Where I attend now, somebody had it on his heart to actually start a 12-step meeting during class time. So it was one of the classes, and I don't know if you all are familiar with 12-step meetings, but they work through what's called the 12 steps, and it's typically for addictions, but it gets into all kinds of other things, codependency and things. And so the first step is, like, we admitted we were powerless over our addictions and compulsive behaviors, that our lives had become unmanageable. Step one to acknowledging that I have a problem is to say, I've got a problem. Like, I'm not going to show up and say, hey, I'm pretty good. The leader of that group, he had addictions in his history, and he said he knew he was dying when he was in the heart of his addictions. He said, I feel very sad for the people sitting in church who don't know they're dying, because they are. I just think we show up a lot of times and we're not real with each other. And I think we just need to be more authentic, because the more people were vulnerable, the more others felt vulnerable to share too. And then you realize, like, oh, wow, like all of us have got our stuff. And I just think that's what we need in church, more authenticity.
So from a ministry perspective, wow, there's so much here. There's so much I want to say and add. Like, I want to make a list here. And like, coming off of that, you mentioned the prodigal, and our tendency, like, you even checked it. Like, you went and looked up the definition of prodigal because it like caught your attention. You're like, I don't know about that. And I think sometimes in our churches, we get so, and one of the things, maybe this goes back to the previous one, what prevents growth, when we're so obsessed with getting it right and the rules that we're constantly in watchdog mode, boy, it prevents growth. And so what happens is you got people who are like, wait a second, you called God prodigal God. And like, when you got a church full of people who jump on that and are like, you can't say that God is not reckless. Like the song Reckless Love, right?
Yes.
Love that song.
Yeah,
Right?
that
There's some
exact
folks who
conversation.
yeah, we've had these conversations before. And like, when we're constantly in watchdog mode and don't allow for some creativity. Now, here's the deal. If I refer to God as reckless or prodigal every Sunday, that's not healthy. But to say, is there a sense in which the love of God is recklessly extravagant? Yes. I just probably don't want to use that. Like, if that's how I describe God's love every single Sunday, then yeah, maybe that's out of balance or whatever. But I think when we're constantly in watchdog mode, like stuffing creativity, like always kind of blocking creativity, then I think it's going to prevent growth. So here's my answer to the question. Like, from a positive perspective, I would say a focus on discipleship or spiritual formation. In other words, doing church, when we do church, we're not just doing church to do church, but we're doing church with intentionality that says, how can we help our members become more like Jesus? I think churches that struggle and die are just, and they have good hearts, right? We're not church bashing here, but they're just going through the motions of doing church. Like, okay, as long as everybody shows up, however many times a week we have church, that's sufficient, right? And the preacher can kind of be disorganized about what he preaches on, and it's random stuff every single week or whatever the preacher feels like preaching on. But like, I think churches that thrive and grow say, our goal is to help people become more like Jesus. And so we're going to be really intentional every time we're gathered, with every activity we do, that it's geared towards helping people become more like Jesus. One step. Like, if you could encourage church leaders to take one action step based on our conversation today, what would it be, Jared?
So from a leadership sense, and this is not a quick step, but I think that if they could do one thing, leaders should sit down to figure out what is the direction that we are moving, right? We are starting with Scripture. We are starting with God's intent for the church. And so looking at our community around, it really goes back to y'all's 3 areas, right? Like looking at the people around us we need to minister to, looking at our own congregants and figuring out what needs they have that need to be addressed. How are we communicating these things? How are we taking care of them? And then figuring out how do we be proactive in these areas within the constraints we may have, instead of just being reactionary. Like a simple example might be, it's summertime, everyone's doing a vacation Bible school, right? And so I think, it's quick. It's easy to sit down and just say, well, we're going to do a VBS in the summer because that's what churches do. But to what end, right? Like, are we following up for evangelistic efforts? Are we asking people who may visit, do you have needs that we can help address? Is there a plan? Like how are we helping these kids see Jesus during VBS? Or is it just, an entertaining event for them to come to? Just that sort of intentionality with everything, right? Instead of just saying, well, we are doing these things, that's good enough. Is there an actual direction and plan that we're doing to advance the church?
Yeah, and that goes along with communication too. The word intentional, I think, is very important. I think Matt's mentioned that. Every one of us has mentioned that. Being intentional in how things are communicated, and for an action step for communication, for example, when we think about making communication a priority, we can have the best intentions of doing things, but if we're not communicating that to those that we're leading, nobody's going to know what great ideas and great plans that we have. So one of the action steps that I've thought about, and I don't know if I've really ever seen this, and y'all could tell me if this is something that in your churches that you have, but we have different groups, different deacons, whatever. I don't really know of any that's just like, we have some that are like marketing and things like that, but a communication group that is knowledgeable in certain things, communication, how to get information out there to the parties that are involved with different demographics that are included in that group. So if older people get their information one way, having an older member in that group to disseminate that information to the older members of the congregation, younger demographics might get their information by social media. So someone that's knowledgeable in social media disseminating that information. So having a group, I don't know, you can call it a leadership group, whatever you want to call it, maybe a deacon that's over a certain group that's over just communication, right? How do we include what our mission and goals are? How are we going to execute this plan in this way? But having different individuals in that group that can make sure everyone in the congregation is getting that information. I think that's a great, I think that would be beneficial to any congregation, just because we can have the best intentions of what we want to do, but if we're not executing that and communicating that to everyone in the congregation and they're not getting the information they need to hear, then it's kind of going in one ear out the other because they're not getting it. So maybe just having a group of individuals that is one of the main ministries that they have is communication, right? We're communicating what the mission of the church is, the goals that we have. Let's execute that the best we can by communicating that to everybody in the congregation the best way that we can. I think that's one that I thought of that maybe hasn't been done, that maybe could easily be implemented in a lot of churches.
That's a great idea.
I love that. Yeah. As far as mental health, it's tricky because you're asking people to really open up and let's take these steps, and then that itself can become a check in the box to do these things, and they don't really meet the need. But if I were to say what is something that is actionable to start this process, I would encourage the leaders of congregations to start openly telling their stories and where God has shown up for them. I grew up in conservative church my whole life, and then I worked in a rehab for a while, and hearing people who came from horrible abuse and trauma and drug addiction, and then they have this moment where they connect with God, and they're like, wow, like what a story. The reality is we do all have that story. Like that guy told me, I feel sad for people who don't know they're dying. I think people just don't fully get authentic and tell their stories. And then how do we encourage that within a church? I think that has to start with the leadership. If a leader's not comfortable getting up in front of the rest of the congregation, I think they should start with each other and start coming up with a plan for getting that story out. If they're not comfortable doing that, each of them finding a safe person that they do feel comfortable telling their story, because the more you tell your story, the more you have the courage and the comfort to tell it in more open spaces. And if our leaders don't do that, what that sends, the message that could send to the rest of the church is we're all supposed to have it together, and we don't. That's just not true. So the action step, I think, is for leadership to start talking about their vulnerabilities, their struggles, and being more authentic about how God has redeemed them.
That's huge. I love that. So from a ministry perspective, I would just say, I think church leaders, especially if they want to slowly turn the ship, which is hard to do sometimes, right? I think you got to make goals, right? Do you have any concrete goals of where we want to go? And that goes back to some of what Jared's been saying. And then the problem, a lot of people have goals. You got to have concrete attainable goals, and then concrete action steps. But for me, I want to add kind of a third part of that, or I guess another question: are our action steps relevant in our culture in 2025? I think a lot of folks will be like, yeah, we have goals, we have action steps, but the action steps are action steps that worked 50 years ago. And so going back to what you said about Vacation Bible School, so that is an example, or whatever event. Okay, here's our goal. We want to grow by this number, or we want to reach this many people. Okay, here are our action steps. Does that action step work today? Has it worked over the past? Because if it's the same thing we've been doing for 10 years and we've only been on a decline, why would we continue to do that thing?
Yeah.
So I would encourage leaders to be like, okay, here are our action steps to reach our goals. And we're going to ask and be brutally honest, does this action step work in our culture anymore?
Any other thoughts that y'all have on anything with what we've discussed today? All right. Well, thanks for joining us on Navigating the Four today. We hope today's conversation sparked something real in your faith, your healing, your leadership, or your communication. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe, share with a friend, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep showing up, keep growing, and keep navigating the four. We'll see you next time on Navigating the Four podcast.